You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Okay, so I think we're good to start recording. Our levels still look good from yesterday, and
good. Okay,
things are set up. Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Record, and my father, Jake Record. We're doing this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek The Next Generation fans out there that we're putting all these shows out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, for our second night in a row recording from your place in New York.
It's been a lot of fun having you here, especially getting to see you spend time with your grandson, Ben.
Yes.
So tonight we're actually reviewing a really fun episode. We're reviewing Manhunt, which is Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 19, which debuted on June 19th, 1989, with a star date of 42859.2. I actually wanted to take a moment and note that between the last episode that we reviewed, Up the Long Ladder, which debuted on May 22nd, 1989, almost a month has passed between these two episodes. It really makes you wonder what the debut and schedule, or what the premiere schedule was for Star Trek episodes, because this is a long time between the two. I wonder if there was a seasonal break, or...
I noticed in, some of the older television series they've been watching like this, that it you expect it to be like it was back in the 50s and 60s, where
almost weekly.
The season starts in September, it's almost weekly up until May or June, and then they have a summer break and reruns. But it seems like they do have, back in this period, and even now, that there are just, production breaks. Some of them
right.
a couple months. Sometimes, of course, with some of the things like, Game of Thrones, that was like every year.
Right.
A new set of stories came.
There was a 2-year period between Game of Thrones Season 7 and Season 8, the final season.
Right.
And if you're a fan of the books, there is now an 11-year period between Book 5 and Book 6, which has not come out yet, of a 7-book series. So imagine what those fans are going through.
Yeah.
But as I said, this is really kind of a fun episode. To dig into it real quick, because it really is the basic premise. There's one storyline to the entire thing. So the USS Enterprise D and the crew are on a mission to deliver the Antedian dignitaries from Antedi 3, where they are brought aboard in a catatonic state with a vat of, I think,
Vermicula.
Vermicula, which seems to be small fish-like creatures.
Looks like it was, they actually took, to me it looked like they took squid and just chopped them up.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, that's what I thought too. I thought it was either squid or like big prawns.
Yeah.
But these fish-like creatures have been brought aboard because apparently they are dignitaries on the way to a conference on Pacifica. The USS Enterprise D is unexpectedly ordered by Starfleet to pick up Lwuxana Troi and give to her full diplomatic status and courtesies. Before they even get to the order, Lwuxana is caught up in a Federation transport. She is going to the conference to represent Beta Z, and which draws the ire of her daughter because apparently Lwuxana is also on the hunt for a husband, which is the main storyline that we're going to talk about tonight.
Right.
So, fun episode. It's kind of a mishmash of a bunch of different stories. There's, I think, a lot of different interplays going on in terms of Captain Picard trying to get away from Lwuxana, Lwuxana trying to find different mates, her relationship with Deanna Troi, and also some of the intricacies that we don't see between Riker and Troy kind of show up in this episode. But the first thing about this episode is that they're on the way to a conference on Pacifica. They've used the planet Pacifica before for shore-leaving conferences in previous episodes and in future episodes. Apparently, Pacifica is an ocean-like world that features very beautiful beaches. So I have to imagine this planet is probably in some sort of Goldilocks zone.
Oh, yeah.
And they have found a star system, which, is kind of the miraculous thing that we're looking for. I think the closest one that we know of is Alpha Centauri.
Right.
Or maybe it's Proxima B.
Yeah.
I think it might be Alpha Centauri.
Yeah.
But we know that Proxima B is also has Goldilocks planets. But I think it's very interesting that the Federation in the future actually has planets designated as planets for diplomatic planets. For places of meeting like Switzerland or.
Well, it could be the kind of thing where it's a resort, so a lot of times conferences, even now, will go to resorts.
Right.
So they have a relaxed setting and that sort of thing. So it could be a little bit of that also.
What do you think it says about the future in the 24th century that they actually have resort planets and they're still, you've gone to so many conferences around the world in tissue banking and transplantation. What do you think it says about the future that they still have resort planets and they're having conferences and that this kind of thing is still going on?
Well, it's just saying that, that the technology has changed so that humans and other species can roam the galaxy and so forth, but they're making the supposition here in the storyline that the basics, there's some, important social changes have gone on in terms of ending poverty and not having to use money, a new economic system and so forth. But they seem to have been done a lot of work to maintain a good work-life balance and
leisure,
and they still have, the idea of a vacation, of people going to a resort. What's the one planet they got? Risa. And there are others.
Oh, the horror island of space.
Right. And things of that sort. So, it's kind of saying that there's going to be some basic things about humans and related humanoid races that aren't going to change over the next several centuries. And that's a real interesting supposition because, just with everything that's happening right now, and because of the pandemic and changes in workflow and the social pressure on people who have lost their jobs now and going back to the jobs and the salary scale needs to change and just all of the changes that are going on at this place, it makes you wonder whether the supposition that they're making in this episode that there's going to be basic things about human that doesn't change, is that going to be true? Or give it 100 years or 200 years that our society might be very different, actually?
That's a very good question. I think, I think on one hand, you can look at these conferences and you can kind of look at the people they attract, like Lwuxana Troi, who is a very wealthy woman. But also, like, a lot of these people who are coming to the conferences are in relatively powerful positions. I think it says something about maybe it says something about 1989, but I think it says something about now, that if you look at when world leaders and the heads of banks and business go to Davos for the World Economic Forum, and they go really to this palatial town, and they enjoy all of these luxuries, it really makes you wonder what sort of power is availed to these people in the future. Like, do they have a different sort of life from the common layperson when it comes to luxury? In a post-scarcity society, what is luxury after that? Because, we kind of use luxury today economically to really define the haves and have-nots. It's one thing to have a good car, but it's another thing to have a great car. It's one thing to have, a nice house, but to have a mansion, I wonder if that dynamic exists in the future the way it exists here now, and if that plays into any societal tension.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's exactly what I'm talking about is, are there going to be social and socioeconomic changes in the next 100 to 200 years so that, what is being imagined in the 24th century and the next generation just isn't accurate.
Can I maybe conjecture for a moment?
Sure.
And it's a good thing I'm admitting that this is conjecture. I often think, and we often discuss, what the future of not only America's economic status is going to look like, but the global marketplace in general. And I think that the way things are headed, I don't think that market systems are going away. I think that we know just from the travails of the USSR, but also like other third world countries where they have had large scale corruption, maybe due to a lack of democracy, but also other things like military juntas, drug trades, difficult geographic circumstances. There's a great book called Prisoner of Geography that Dad and I have both read that I recommend to everyone. I think it's written by Tim Weiss. But it seems it'd be one thing if the diplomat was living in an apartment next to the baker in the 24th century, and then the diplomat still goes Pacifica, and it's still a luxury thing, but he comes back to the apartment, he lives next to the living next to the baker. Is the lifestyle of the baker and the diplomat that greatly divided in the future, or do they have kind of a similar economic situation? Because, Picard has said in previous episodes that they did away for the quest of material gain and material possessions. So what does that really look like on a functional level in terms of how people live aesthetically? Is everyone kind of minimalistic, or are there people that want bigger houses and want bigger things and want more clothes, or has everyone given that up and some people may have large amounts of capital, but they don't use it the way we see people use capital today?
That's an interesting conjecture. I think that there's going to be a tendency for, what we're working on now is, we're working on in 2021, particularly in the United States and our economic system and culture, what we're trying to do is the breadth of the economic spectrum is just so wide. You have people that are homeless and a growing homeless problem. And then on the other hand, you have people that are ultra wealthy. And
obscenely wealthy.
I saw a article today online, I didn't get to read it, but it was implying that if you're in the 1%, you still have something to fear, and that's the ultra rich.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that what we're trying to deal with is to put things back into balance, and it's a real, tough issue. The progressive politicians want to say, basically, well, let's just, give everybody, a basic annual income and so forth, and there's merit to that idea. But if you take in, some conservative principles that, if you root through conservatism, you can find some things that do make sense. I think the conservatives right now are so, bereft of, a real policy direction that none of that comes out. But what we're trying to do is put a degree of fairness into the socioeconomic spectrum, to use that term, so it's not so wide. Right. So that what we really have to do is get people through, an income guarantee, education, so they can have decent jobs. We have to reinvent jobs because of what AI is going to do and so forth. So we need to get, rather than having, rather than having people that are totally off the economic scale and are homeless, they have to have a livable income. They have to have access to health care.
Housing.
Housing. I think they do need to have some responsibilities and job. They have to put some money back in through taxes and so forth. So
Right.
there is skin in the game. And that might, because of taxation and particularly corporate taxes, it might bring the top end of the socioeconomic spectrum down. But I don't think it's going to eliminate the ultra wealthy.
Well,
And thus, it's not going to eliminate individuals who have the capability to have mansions or have flying cars or have their own, well, this is yet to be seen, or have their own companies so that they can take suborbital trips into space, which, as far as I'm concerned, is you don't go into orbit, you really haven't gone into space.
yeah. Well, as far as I'm concerned, if your oxygen doesn't kick on, like, are you really up there?
Mhm.
Because even Branson didn't have to be on any oxygen during his flight.
Right.
He was able to take his mask off while he was.
Yeah, they're in a pressurizable cabin.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's kind of bullshit. Anyway, I think to get to what you just said about how we're kind of trying to equalize things a little bit.
Make it more fair, really.
Well, one thing that really bothers me about today's modern capitalist is that if you somehow guaranteed for the lowest economic strata some form of social and economic mobility, if you just guaranteed that, if you took your trillions of dollars, because you said something, the ultra rich, and that how the ultra rich should fear them, I think that's absolutely true. One thing that I worry about is that we actually already have a class of trillionaires, and they're just so rich they're able to keep their names out of the media.
Right.
And, at one point, Jeff Bezos was said to have been worth $1 trillion, and then he had that scrubbed from his newspapers. I think the thing that capitalism has forgotten is that it really does have to ensure social and upward economic mobility for all, because if it doesn't, it really isn't living out the promise. Because the basic promise of capitalism is that you should be able to learn some sort of usable skill, whatever it is, and you should be able to go and use your skill to create some sort of human value for yourself, and at least gain, the dignity of being able to house yourself, being able to feed yourself and clothe yourself. Whether you can do that with other people, like, one person doing that with a family, I think that the mode of that in general is questionable. But to get to your question about, your point about universal basic income, I think universal basic income is definitely something we have to consider in the future. But I think we're going that way anyway. Dad and I were at dinner with my wife earlier tonight, and as we sometimes do, we talked about politics, and I expressed some of my disappointments about the Biden administration. One thing that I do have to give the Biden administration credit for here in July of 2021 is the earned income child tax credit.
Right, yes.
In some ways, that's a universal basic income starting out.
Sure.
The government really should be in the business of paying people to have children and being able to keep those children safe and healthy and give them some sort of economic security, because these are the future citizens. And if $300 to $600 can really change the outcome of a child's future to make them a better American and a better global citizen,
and from a capitalist standpoint, it's sort of thing where you don't want to have people fall out of society, so they're not participating in the market. They're not consumers, nor are they producers.
Right.
And you want to have both. And one of the things we were talking about the other day is in many Western countries, including now the United States, that our fertility rate is getting to the point that we're not going to replace ourselves. Perhaps with immigration, which has greatly contributed to population growth in this country, for the last 50 years. That's still going to have an influence, but right now we're anti-immigrant. So one of the NPR shows I listened to yesterday, or whatever day it was a couple of days ago, it really talked about, um, um, the cost of living and
Right.
things like that, which can have an effect on how many children, a woman will have.
Right.
And so, if you can't afford the child, just as an infant, and then you can't afford to educate it as needed be after it gets out of high school and so on, then parents are being disincentivized to have children. And that is, again, a problem because they are the producers and consumers of the market economy that you want as capitalists in the future.
Right. Well, like, even to the extent that we subsidize children, we do so at the benefit of so many different sectors. Just not even within that, not even within the economy, but like, these are our future. This is the future generation of our military. This is the future generation of our government. These are our future doctors and lawyers. It's important now to actually invest, because if you look at the damage that COVID has caused, and if you look at the real economic damage that was happening before COVID, these children really do need this kind of economic supplementation if they are to keep abreast of the rest of the world, first world, in terms of what those kids are learning and what those kids are being educated on. Because I have to say, pardon me, I went to grad school with the idea that I was going to enter education, and I taught a little bit at the secondary education level. High school history. I did U.S. history, world civ, and economics. And one thing that I learned while going through grad school and learning about different educational systems, in some ways America really does have a high quality education because we have access to educational tools and knowledge and libraries that most of the world doesn't have. The problem is we underfund our education so much that every other country is able to make up for it, and they've been able to really progress the state of their education systems where their children, in my opinion, get just a high quality education as we do, not only functionally in terms of going out and paying your bills and getting a job and setting up your future, but also as human beings. There's an enrichment of the arts in the rest of the world that we have really let fall to the wayside. And, that $300 to $600, that's not just, your kid's lunch. That could be your child's instrument rental for the year. That could be the lacrosse stick for the team. There's so many things that those kind of things can add to the next generation that, you don't necessarily need give people $1,000. There's other things that you can do too. Like, I really do think that you need to start giving people incentives to invest in more green technology. Like, you should give people tax credits to buy electric vehicles, I think, and then, maintain them as well.
Right.
We're talking about the difficulty we're having now vaccinating people. I think that you should pay people to not only go to the doctor and get checked up, but actually stay healthy. I think they should get tax credit for staying healthy. And we talk about preventative medicine a lot. We could turn that into a tax credit where, if you are able to maintain a certain standard of health and you're able to stay out of a certain risk pool, because all of these insurance companies are determining how much a person pays on the premium by the risk pool they fall into in terms of their pre-existing conditions, comorbidity, stuff like that. You could really start minimizing those if you paid people to really take their health seriously and invest that money into their own preventative care, because that they could take that money. That's their money to not only get to the job, but maybe get to a gym, buy better food. There's, you don't have to just give someone $1,000. You can give them $300 for their groceries, or $200 for their gas, or $500 for their kids. It doesn't have to just be hand them $1,000 and just give it away.
So now that we've come up for options as to advanced society. How does this go back to the episode then, circle back there?
Well, I think the important thing about Star Trek is that they have created a society where people can advance in terms of their enjoyment of life,
Right.
but the actual material gain of it is not the primary benefit that they're getting.
Right.
They're actually trying to enrich themselves on a
Right.
human, spiritual, mental
Yes.
level.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it really is the quest for the inner self that is being externalized in Star Trek and externalized in how they govern themselves and how they create their economies.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, just as we were talking about this, is that, the series we're reviewing is Star Trek The Next Generation.
Right.
So it's not just the next generation after the original series. It's really, everything that's being put out here in terms of, scientific science fiction, in essence, socioeconomic science fiction, if you can use that term. It's thinking about how things are going to be in the future. And
Right.
as we've said to one another in the past, one of the values to science fiction, and particularly to stories like Star Trek, is, to paint a picture of what humanity could become
Right.
in a positive way, but still acknowledging that there are problems to be solved. They still have wars to deal with, they still have diplomacy, they still have racial hatred to deal with. They do have some, at least Starfleet has some issues about where their dilithium crystals come from to make sure they have
Right.
enough energy, to power the ships and so on. But as you said, overall, it's a much more healthy, balanced society that's not driven just by accumulation of wealth.
Well, I think the reverse of that, and it's something that we can get back to Lwuxana Troi with, because it kind of annoys people, at least in this episode. I don't think it annoys the audience, but one thing that I think, even if you took away the motivation for wealth and profit from humans,
Mhm.
I think that we would still be bound to the lesser parts of our anger and our greeds and our hatreds and our lusts and stuff like that. So I think, Deanna in this episode senses the approach of Ramona Lwuxana Troi, and apparently Lwuxana has entered this phase where she is essentially at her sexual height,
peak.
sexual
Yeah.
peak.
Right.
And this is somewhat troubling her telepathic powers and being able to read people, because she's constantly teasing Captain Picard of his sexual attraction to her, which he just certifies over and over again, which is not true. So there's either one of two things happening here. Either Lwuxana's right and Picard really does have the hots for her, or her chemicals are so out of balance in terms of her betazoid physiology that she can't read anything right now. But the point I'm trying to get here is that you still have a character who is, she is trying to fill something with sex, and she's trying to fill something with companionship, and she's still trying to struggle to maintain, I think, this vestige of youth. And that's still such a human thing for us to do,
Mm-hmm.
to try to struggle in vain against these existential things.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you take away, the things that make things in the world scarce, even if you take away the motivation for money and profit, we are still troubled by these things. And Lwuxana in this episode is troubled because she's truly lonely, and she wants to find a companion. It's not just that she has the sexual hots for Picard or Riker or Rex, the hologram bartender, later on. This is a quest to find a companion, and many of the episodes we see her in later on in the future are her trying to find a companionship. I think the thing that I'm circling back to here is that even in the future, our human frailties, especially the inner ones, may not only just continue to play a part in our lives, but because we remove the motivation for profit and the accumulation of wealth, they may play may play bigger impacts, because we have to remember she's doing this on a Galaxy class Federation flagship in the middle of her being an official ambassador. This is not the behavior of an ambassador in any way, shape, or form, but she's still failing to find the thing that she's looking for in this. And it's coming out in this wanton behavior that everyone around her is putting up with because she's an ambassador. It really makes you wonder, how do people behave in the future when they're not necessarily muted by certain things?
Well, plus this is a creation of a non-human,
Right.
non-human being. I mean, they're humanoid, but they're not Homo sapiens.
Right.
And she's a very interesting character, the way they've written her, in that
She's great.
She can be very flighty, and with this phase that she's in, where she's hunting for a new mate, a new husband, and so forth. She can really then focus in, because she's kind of a no bullshit kind of person.
Right, that too.
So
and very smart.
Yes, so she can cut to the chase, as when it seems like once the Antedians wake up, and she pays attention to them, she says, "Oh, they're not diplomats; they're assassins."
Right.
And it's like one of the things we've kind of mentioned in our notes is why didn't she reveal that sooner? And it could be that simply that she found them loathsome, she found them unattractive.
They were asleep.
And that she couldn't read. Their neural system, their brain may have been shut down so that she couldn't read them. And then after they woke up, and they were going to beam down to the planet, with herself and Mr. Hom, she very easily read their minds and said, "Oh, these aren't bona fide diplomats. They're assassins.
Their robes are lined with
terrorists.
ultrarium."
Yeah, terrorists.
Yeah. You know what? I think you make a lot of great points there. Focusing on Lwuxana for a moment, because this is really a Lwuxana episode. If we're going to talk about anyone, we should talk about her. I think to a certain extent she's interesting from the perspective of defining a purebred Betazoid woman, because we have to remember Troy's half Betazoid because her father's human.
Right.
There's a conversation in Picard's Ready Room about the sexual phases of Betazoid women, where we, as previously mentioned, Lwuxana has entered a phase, kind of in her later years, that she has reached her sexual peak. And Riker, you've noted when we watched the episode earlier today, but also in the notes, that Riker and Troi are comfortably seated together.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've always found Star Trek interesting in terms of how it handles the sexuality of different alien species, because even though the Betazoids are humanoid and look humanoid, they are still aliens.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that they have somehow, whatever their evolutionary development has been later on in life, because Lwuxana is probably, in her late 40s, early 50s?
Oh, at least, yeah. 50s, I would say.
Yeah. I'm not going to guess at Majel Barrett's age at this point,
right,
ladies and gentlemen. I was raised better. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's very interesting that Betazoid women develop this kind of sexual drive later on in their lives.
Right.
Versus, the Vulcans, where they have Pon farr every 7 years.
Right.
I think Star Trek takes a very different look at the evolutionary side of sex. And I was wondering if you had, as a biologist, any reflections on that, and, just any comments on, putting the storytelling and maybe the humorous side of sex in Star Trek away. What do you think of it from a scientific standpoint, in terms of what the show is sometimes presented?
In this case, in terms of, different humanoid species, how would their sexual maturation be different? Yeah, I'd have to think on that a little bit. I mean, there certainly would be variability in that. I mean, just taking the Antedians. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are very, like Piscine humanoids who look like fish people.
Right.
So how...
What a handsome race.
Right. So how would how would sexual reproduction take place between them?
Mhm.
And then you get in the bigger issue, more abstracted, in Next Generation, and particularly some of the other Star Trek and franchises like Voyager that we've started to watch the last several days just for fun. And this has shown up in Next Generation that there are life forms out there that are really pure energy.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one that they came across that just went through binary fission.
Right.
But is it binary fission, or were there some sort of sexual reproduction there? We don't.
Right.
We don't know. So, and I'm thinking there's one in Next Generation where they find some sort of. The far point. I
Yeah.
mean, the first one is a perfect thing. It's like,
the jellyfish mates.
yeah, the jellyfish mates and so forth. So, they're, since, I think a lot of people believe that since we're finding so many exoplanets,
Mhm.
and many of them are, M-class or Earth-like, and could support some form of life, unless there was really some progenitor race, which is very much a scientific story, that seeded their DNA throughout the galaxy.
Right. Which Star Trek Next Generation will deal with in a future episode.
We'll deal with, and then you get into the question is, okay, if you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of planets that could support life in some form, with that amount of variability, you have to consider that those sentient life forms. Well, one, they could have life on a planet that wouldn't be sentient, although there's a lot of debate about what sentience means and so forth. But if it was a functional entity that understood science and had some religious sense and understood about how they had to have a society and so forth, they could evolve totally differently, and thus their sexual practices and habits could be very different too.
Very true. Well, getting back to the Vulcans, the Ponfar very much is a cultural. They've built cultural rights around it,
Mm-hmm.
and it wouldn't. One question that we should ask about the future, if Lwuxana is older in her years and she's looking for a partner, she might not necessarily be looking for a partner to conceive a child.
Correct. That's a good point. Yes.
Culturally, this could just be something that they've built biologically, where it's about her finding a mate. It's
Yes.
not about her bearing a child.
It's
at
about
all.
being lonely and having companionship,
Right.
as you had
And
mentioned.
but that could be an interesting thing that a society builds in as a cultural norm. When you hit this age, we know you're biologically going to go through this. You should go find someone.
Mm-hmm.
And then they build certain structures and certain social mores around that. Because, we see her in future episodes constantly trying to find a mate and even losing them to some other social mores. But one thing that's interesting about Beta-Zeds, or Betazoids, they're very open to genetic mixing, or mixing with other species,
Yeah,
and having
right.
children. Because,
Yeah.
Troi is half Betazoid. It wouldn't surprise, she at one point she even says she finds Worf handsome.
Mm-hmm.
So the realm of possibility is not out there that she wouldn't have a child with a Klingon,
Mhm.
or there wouldn't be a Betazoid out there that wouldn't have a child with a Klingon. And we've seen half human, half Klingon children already.
Right,
We're going to
sure.
see Alexander in the future.
Right.
I think it says something interesting about the Betazoids in general, that maybe as a race they are not genetically, what's the word I'm looking for? Not heteronormative. Heterogeneous? They're not genetically pure, because they've actually gone out into the galaxy and actually
Right.
intermarried
Right.
with a lot of different societies.
Sure. Okay.
So maybe it raises the question, what does it actually mean to be Beta-Z? I mean, to be a Betazoid, because we know that Lwuxana is considered a full Betazoid. But if she's intermarrying with humans, and that's not something that's taboo, is there something in her genetics in the past that maybe she wasn't Betazoid? And if, and this gets into the genetic squares from science, but like, let's say Troi, we know she marries Riker, but let's say if she married a full-blooded Betazoid in the future, that child would be what?
It'd be essence if Troy married a full-blooded Betazoid.
Yeah.
Well, the child would be basically, 3/4 Beta Z and 1/4 human.
And then if that child, when that 3/4 Betazoid married a full-blood Betazoid again, that child would be...
There would still be a certain percentage of human DNA.
But generationally, if they kept intermarrying pure-blood Betazoids. So, like, my point is, like, over history, people can intermarry and they move in and out of their species, maybe in the future.
Right.
So maybe the concentration of Betazoid blood historically is not that important.
Well, I mean, it's an example, a practical example. I think that give it a couple hundred years,
right,
that there's more, and it's not illegal for black people to marry white people and people from different races.
Miscegenation laws.
There's no miscegenation laws. And you see a lot more, not just in television commercials, but actually on the street, whether you're in New York or North Carolina, you see a lot of multiracial couples now. And I'm talking about...
And children.
Black and white, white and Asian, black and Asian, and so forth. So, once you start putting, genes and DNA in from darker skinned people, whether they be coffee colored, brown, black, whatever, I think you're going to see a lightening. You may not see as many dark skinned African American people, and you may not see as many, classical Western European white people. I can see with the U.S., and you can see a lot of this now, we're really becoming coffee colored.
Yeah. Well, we're definitely taking on a more olive and darker complexions.
Yes, right.
And I think that is also part of what naturally happens. Like, one thing that we have to acknowledge in human history is that we have, some of us still carry Neanderthal DNA.
Right.
And the reason why we carry Neanderthal DNA is because Homo sapiens at some point intermarried with Cro-Magnons and produced children.
Well, not Cro-Magnons.
Well, Neanderthal.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
Neanderthals.
Yeah.
But, this idea that humans have somehow stayed within their own species and not intermarried outside of it historically isn't true either.
There's more data that's come out just recently as the paleontologists have really discovered, been able to get access to some Neanderthal DNA, Denisovin DNA.
Yeah.
There's actually, in some parts of Southeast Asia, they think that there are other past human species that actually have died out.
Actually, there's a interesting within the study of science and religion, and also the study of science and mythology. I can't remember their right names at the moment. There's actually a theory that when we talk about creatures like elves and dwarves and certain things like that, they may have actually been talking about in the past different forms of Homo erectus. That maybe there was a human-like cousin to the Homo sapien that maybe had pointed ears genetically or lived longer, or, we know that Neanderthals were bigger and thicker than us.
Right.
And probably much, much stronger.
Right.
The idea that there may have been different forms of quote-unquote human species out there is definitely a possibility, because, we wiped out, the Neanderthal was either bred out or wiped out. It's not out of the realm of possibility, especially with the Denisovans, that there are more species out there that we intermarried with, or maybe warred with, or
possibly
maybe integrated in with us.
Yes.
Lwuxana sees human men as a commodity, and this episode really does reflect that in terms of how she treats Picard during dinner, rubbing his leg with her foot, being sexually aggressive with him and Riker, even going to the point of, telling Riker we're getting married, whether, without any real consent. of Riker or Deanna, who is clearly upset by the entire situation.
Right.
In 1989, I don't think was the Equal Rights Amendment just a point of discussion in the 1980s of that
Yeah,
moment?
it had been introduced in the early 80s, so of course it hadn't been resolved, it still wasn't resolved. And I thought that since we talked about how the writers of Next Generation, tried to make sort of social comment on, how society was then, my impression was that since
Especially before Rick Berman, and we'll talk about him later.
yeah, that Lwuxana was very aggressive. That it was sort of a role reversal going on,
Right.
and demonstrating to men. I said, look, if you think about this, look how she's
Making them so uncomfortable.
making them uncomfortable, treating them as sexual objects, and this is what men do, particularly in Western society and some other a lot of societies, most societies, it seems that the women are second-class citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was a very interesting, kind of lighthearted social commentary on just pointing out how things are and maybe how they need to change in the future.
I think you have a very good point about the commodification of the sexes, especially Lwuxana kind of commodifying the men on board the Enterprise. And I think you're right. I think there is a little bit of a role reversal going on here because probably definitely in the late 80s, but even today there is a commodification of women, especially women's bodies. Not necessarily women's personalities or women's souls, but especially women's bodies, and even men's bodies too. I think we don't talk enough about how this society really is body-centric in a lot of ways, and we put a lot of our material concerns towards the human form.
Mm-hmm.
I think that has led to some of this monopolistic behavior where we have been able to, men think that we have the ability to tell women how to think, feel, dress, and exist. But Lwuxana, you're right, paints a very interesting relief to that idea. And the fact that she really is kind of degrading. Even Mr. Home, who's a great Star Trek character. And I have to look up the actor real quick. I have him right here. Because Mr. Home is played by the fantastic Carol Struckian. Carell Struckian. Yeah, Carell Struckian.
Mm-hmm.
Who also played Lurch in the Addams Family. Even the way she treats Lurch is the way that the kind of prototypical CEO in Mad Men, which is a show about 1950s advertising, would treat their secretaries. Very dismissive, very, this is my assistant, but they're just kind of here to make sure my whims are done. Even though he has a tremendous tolerance for alcoholic beverages to the point of it being very humorous. He accepts being demeaned, but there is kind of this motif in the 1950s and 60s of you had the bubbly secretary who was willing to be treated like shit by her boss because she was just lucky to have a job and just lucky to be there. And I think you're right. This character really is a fascinating reversal of all that. I mean, Lwuxana and Mr. Home. So, one thing that I find interesting... one thing that Picard tries to do to get away from Lwuxana is divert himself to the holodeck to hide from there, where he takes on the role of Dixon Hill again, the 1941 detective located in San Francisco, which is Picard's favorite childhood character. He read all the novels and the stories. And he goes in there to basically relax with the program, but he keeps running into these problems where criminals show up, try to shoot him, cases show up to try to initiate themselves, and what he remembers is that the holodeck prevents programs based on a specific story, and it'll make variations on a theme, but it may not necessarily give you what you want. Like,
Right.
Picard wants a vacation. He
Right.
wants to go sit in Dixon
Well,
Hill's
he
office.
wants a hideout for a half a day or something like that. Yeah,
exactly. Which I think is actually a cool thing that you could do on the holodeck.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, like, go take a mini vacation. But one thing that happens is that Picard and Madeline, Dixon Hill's secretary, go to Rex's bar where they meet the character Rex the bartender, who's fantastic. Rex is played by Rod Arentz, who does a really great job here. He's a really affable character. Really feels like a 1941 bartender who is just kind of hip, but also kind of a little sleazy. I really like his interplay with Lwuxana, but it's very interesting that Lwuxana doesn't understand the holodeck and doesn't understand immediately that Rex isn't real.
Right.
And I just find it fascinating. Like, has the character never been briefed on such a thing existing? Like, did Deanna never tell her mom, "Hey, Mom, we have this cool thing on the ship"?
That's interesting. Is how prevalent are holodecks? Is it something that
That's a great
was
question.
created just as a a play tool, a way to
Train cadets.
for training purposes and so forth, that it is only in Starfleet, and it's like they're almost like movie theaters are now. Our holodecks exist in
They have to.
civilian life.
I mean,
it wouldn't be hard to do.
Well, even in Star Trek Picard later on in the future, when Picard is on Rios' ship, the room that Picard uses is a holodeck that
Right.
projects his apartment in France.
France, exactly.
One thing that, you bring up a good question. One thing I did consider until you said something was maybe the holodecks were only used for Starfleet, but then I was like, well, what would the purpose of that be? Would they want to keep them like a top secret training tool? But they have civilians on the Enterprise D, so I have to imagine those civilians know about the holodeck and are using it too. We actually they do. We see Wesley Crusher in season 1. He and his friend go into a ski program when they spread that virus around the ship.
Sure.
So everyone has to be able to have access to it. I know in Voyager, and they'll talk about it. In the future, they have holo novels. Like, the future of publishing isn't actually necessarily written books. You actually write a book and you put it into the holodeck, and it recreates the book that you lived through. Which I actually think, as a publisher, is a really cool thing.
Absolutely.
If you're able to pull that off.
Yeah.
But, I think it's very interesting that she just doesn't get that Rex is a hologram. It seems like a big gap in knowledge for someone that seems very worldly in a galactic sense.
Right.
So let's see, where are we? Oh yeah. So one last thing, because we've had a lot of fun here. Riker has a shit-eating grin and makes fun of Picard most of this episode. And he really doesn't ever get it back. I really enjoyed Frakes' characterization of Riker in this episode. His... the way he and Troi are comfortably seated together in the ready room scene, and just his reaction when he finds out that she would have hit a sexual peak too, if they had remained in a relationship, and just his reaction to that. Frakes plays this character so well.
He does, absolutely.
And so does, I have to say, Marina Sirtis as Troi.
She does as well.
She pulls a lot of really hard things out in this episode.
Yeah.
Before we go, though, Data. We have to talk about Data.
Yes.
So, Data, when he finds out that Riker is going to the holodeck to inform Picard about, I believe... the Antedians have awoken.
Antedians have awakened, yeah.
Right. In a very interesting scene with Pulaski that, is kind of just filler. But the Antedians awaken, and Riker decides he's going to go inform the captain, and Data literally springs up from the helm and basically says, like, if you're going, can I have 5 minutes to do something? And he literally goes and puts on a 1940 zoot suit.
Right.
And fedora.
Right.
Just so he can go play in the holodeck with Captain Picard this mystery from
Yes.
1941. We talk about Data's humanity all the time, but I find it interesting like how quickly in this episode he wants to fall into play.
Yeah, exactly. I've commented on that it's again just shows Data as an android struggling to understand his humanity, but then he demonstrates so much humanity when, almost childlike in a sense, he pops up and he says, "They're going to the holodeck. Can I come along too?"
Right.
Yes. Oh boy, I'm going to go get the play.
Yeah, it's almost so childlike.
Yes.
In many ways, it's almost like Data is more forgetting that he is human, and the stories that we see him is more him reminding himself, "Hey, I'm actually human."
Right.
And he just kind of forgets it because he's an android.
Right.
Let's see. Oh, one thing before we go. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Worf finds the Antedians to actually be a handsome race. And there's an interesting exchange about racial tolerance between Wesley and Worf while observing the Antedians. And I think it's an interesting conversation by today's perspective, because in some sense, Wesley telling Worf that he thinks that he's probably a handsome Klingon would be ruled by today's society as quote unquote a microaggression. But it really does speak to how, even though in the 24th century Klingons are a well-known thing, there really is kind of this distance still between humans and Klingons where they really don't know a lot about each other or how they view things. Because Wesley looks at these fish, these anthropomorphic fishmen, and goes, "Gross," and Worf looks at them and goes, "How handsome." And of course, Lwuxana says they would look better in a sauce, which is just terrible.
Right.
But what do you think of that scene and what it says about the 24th century from the 1989 perspective versus now?
Well, it goes back to what we were saying before, is that how much is society going to change?
Right.
And there's going to be some basic things that probably don't change, that if you, just kind of playing this out, if you come upon a new humanoid species and that species appears very different from us, there's going to be some, a little bit of shock. It's a little bit of acceptance, in both ways. I mean, I related to, just a personal experience then when I don't know if we've talked about this in the podcast before, when I was growing up, not from my parents, but other kids in the neighborhood, I was taught to be fearful of black people.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't called black people. They used, the N-word when they were describing these, that race. So, I had very little exposure to black people up until 7th grade, when I went to an integrated Baltimore City junior high school. And because of that antipathy, that unknowingness of the other and so forth that had been instilled in me, it was like, why am I with these people? They're different. I'm thinking that they were sort of ugly in a sense, not physically, but they just different. I've been taught that they were so different that I shouldn't be around them. I should fear them. And after 2 years at that junior high school in Baltimore City, I found that that kind of went away, because you got used to them, that they were people like you. We joked around with them. In 8th grade art class, there were 6 boys together seated at a work table. It was me, 3 African American guys, and two second generation, first generation, almost Greeks, and we got along fine. And we made jokes about, kind of make jokes about the Greeks, because they had a very successful bakery called, I'll say, H&S Bakery, and the guys whose they were cousins sort of. So that stands for hard and stale. That's what H&S stands for.
Ooh.
So we joked along, and and respected one another. So I think there's a process.
That joke didn't go where I thought it would go.
I think that there's a process when you come,
Good joke.
when you come on the other,
Yeah.
particularly if it's a different species, and you can communicate with them. They're sentient, they're communicative, and so forth. It takes a little while to, adjust to them, and so
Yeah.
on.
Well, it also should be noted, though, that Worf is a very unique case because he is a Klingon raised by humans who is struggling to find his own identity as a Klingon. So Wesley is really kind of maybe talking to the wrong person about these cultural differences because Worf doesn't necessarily have a complete cultural view of his
Right.
own people. He hasn't been around them.
Right, exactly.
So there's a very interesting interplay here. Of course, the way they end this, right before Lwuxana Troi beams off, she chides Picard one last time for having sexual thoughts about her. Before we go, do you think Picard is attracted to Lwuxana Troi?
I think Picard has a certain attraction to Lwuxana Troi, and he will not admit it to anyone, and mostly important, he won't admit it to himself.
And on that, we will end the episode. Dad, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before.
Thank you, Jay.
We will be back next time for Star Trek Next Generation Season 2, Episode 20, The Emissary. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Okay, I think that's